welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be looking at King Solomon today.
King Solomon.
He's famous for being the wise king in the Old Testament, right?
Yes.
But I think, using this biographical study from Liberty University,
Okay.
we're going to uncover some things about him that are really kind of surprising. And maybe make you rethink what you thought you knew about him.
I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. So right off the bat, Solomon's life is pretty dramatic. Now, when I think about it, his birth comes after, kind of a wild chapter in his parents' lives,
Yeah.
King David and Bathsheba.
Right.
Their first son actually died.
Yeah. As a consequence for their sin.
Because of their affair.
Their adultery.
Yeah.
It's kind of a heavy way to start a life.
It is.
Yeah.
But even in that tragedy, you see this element of redemption. Even in his name, Jedediah, it means beloved of the Lord. So it's like, even out of a very difficult situation, God is still working out his purpose.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it seemed like God had big plans for him even before he was born. I mean, there were prophecies about Solomon building the temple, which that's something that his own father wasn't even allowed to do.
Right. There's this idea of a unique covenant, between God and Solomon. It's like a father-son relationship kind of woven into his destiny. And then there's the prophecy that his kingdom would be established forever through him. So just imagine that. Imagine having those expectations.
Wow. Talk about pressure. But it seems like, David really tried to prepare him. I mean, he rallied the whole nation to support Solomon. And he gives him some, pretty important advice.
Absolutely. He stresses how important it is to know God, to serve him with a whole heart, and to be courageous, as a leader, and of course to keep God's law.
I mean, he even prays for him. He says to God, "Give unto Solomon, my son, a perfect heart," which that's pretty powerful. Even the most powerful king was still somebody's son, still vulnerable, still needed guidance.
Absolutely. And you see that guidance was tested immediately.
Yep.
Solomon's rise to power, it wasn't smooth sailing. He had to deal with a coup attempt led by his own half-brother, Adonijah.
Oh, wow. So much for sibling rivalry.
Right.
What did he do?
Well, Solomon acted fast.
Okay.
Decisively. I mean, some might even say ruthlessly. Adonijah, he was executed, along with Joab, David's top general. Abiathar, who was a rebellious priest, he gets banished. And Shimei, who had actually cursed David earlier, he was executed for breaking his parole.
Wow. It's kind of different side of the peaceful, wise king, huh?
Right.
It makes you wonder if that willingness to use force, was that always there? Was that part of him, even before the wisdom?
Right. Yeah.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
And it kind of leads us to that moment, where he really steps into this role as the wisest man who ever lived.
Right. I mean, this happens right at the beginning of his reign. He goes to Gibeon. He offers 1,000 burnt sacrifices.
1,000.
1,000.
That's quite the offering.
Yeah. What was he going for there?
It was a gesture of piety, seeking divine favor.
And it worked, because God appears to him in a dream and says to him, ask for whatever you want.
Wow. I mean, if I were Solomon, I don't even know what I would ask for.
It's tempting to think, infinite wealth, power, invincibility in battle or something, right?
Yeah.
But Solomon asks for something different. He asks for wisdom. Yeah. He knew that to be a good king, to lead his people well, he would need to be able to understand truth, to see people's motivations, to make good judgments.
So he chose wisdom, not power or personal gain.
Right.
That says a lot about him, I think.
It does. And God is obviously pleased with his request, because he grants him not only the wisdom, but also the riches and the honor.
So he gets it all.
He does.
I mean, that wisdom, it's put to the test pretty quickly, right?
Yep.
I mean, think about that story of the two women who both claimed to be the mother of the same baby.
Oh, yeah, that story.
I mean, that's classic Solomon.
It really is a classic example of wisdom in action. He doesn't even rely on evidence or testimony. He just comes up with this test. And it's a test that appeals to, the deepest instincts of a mother's love. He threatens to cut the baby in half, which,
It's a bold move.
It is. It's a bold move. But it forces the true mother to sacrifice, even her claim to the child in order to protect her child.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, though. I mean, does that kind of wisdom, does that just come from, intellect? Or is there something else going on there? Was it divine, or was he just really good at reading people?
That's a question that's fascinated people for centuries.
Yeah.
But one thing's for sure, that judgment, it solidified his reputation for wisdom throughout the world.
It did. And with that wisdom, he kind of ushered in this period of peace and prosperity. For Israel, the kingdom, it grew a lot. And the
Right.
people had a kind of abundance they'd never experienced before. And Solomon, he was able to create this really organized system to manage it all.
Right. He created this whole system with all these different officials. They were responsible for everything, from political matters to food supplies. He made sure the kingdom ran smoothly
Hmm.
and efficiently. And it was during this time of peace and prosperity, that he decides to build the temple in Jerusalem.
The temple, I mean, this was huge, right? It was a symbol of not only Solomon's devotion to God, but also his power.
Yes, building the temple. It was more than just bricks and mortar. It was about solidifying this connection between God and the people of Israel.
And he went all out, right?
Oh, absolutely. He wanted the best materials, the best craftsmen. He even enlisted the help of King Hiram of Tyre.
Wait, King Hiram. So
Yeah.
this was an international collaboration.
It was. Hiram supplied the cedar and fir trees from Lebanon. They were, really important for the construction. And he also sent his best craftsman. His name was also Hiram.
No way.
Yeah. 2 Hirams. And this Hiram, the craftsman, was a half-Jewish master craftsman. He oversaw all these intricate details.
That's incredible. Can you imagine seeing those massive trees,
Yeah.
coming in from Lebanon to Jerusalem?
It must have been an amazing sight. And it was a huge logistical feat to transport them all that way.
Yeah.
But Solomon's organizational skills were incredible. He had this massive workforce, Canaanite and Israelite laborers, and it still took 7.5 years to complete.
7.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's longer than some college degrees.
I know. It's a long time.
Well, I guess when you're building a house for God, you don't want to rush it.
Exactly. And the location was significant.
Yeah.
He picked Mount Moriah. And that's the same spot where Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac.
Oh, wow.
So it was a site that was already very important to their faith.
I can only imagine what it must have been like when they finished it. I mean, the dedication ceremony must have been quite an event.
It was a grand event.
Yeah.
Filled with symbolism and religious meaning. Solomon brought in all the treasures that David had collected, and then the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object for them. It was placed inside the Holy of Holies.
So the heart of their faith, now in this incredible building.
Yeah.
Built by, the wisest king.
And Solomon offers this prayer, recognizing God's faithfulness, asking for God's blessings on Israel. And then at that moment, something amazing happens.
Okay, what happened? I'm on the edge of my seat.
Fire comes down from heaven, consumes the sacrifices.
Yeah.
And then the glory of God, it fills the temple. It's so intense that the priests, they can't even enter.
Wow.
It was this display, of God's approval that confirmed this connection between God and his people.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of all these amazing human achievements, it's God who makes them special, who gives them meaning. But speaking of achievements, we can't forget about Solomon's wealth.
His wealth was legendary. I mean, it surpassed anything anyone had ever seen in the ancient world. It's more than just gold and silver, too, though there was a lot of that. I mean, his treasury had precious stones, sandalwood, rare spices, ivory.
Like he was living like a pharaoh, but with better, PR.
Yeah.
Right.
He lived a lavish lifestyle, that's for sure. I mean, the amount of food his staff needed every day was ridiculous, and his palaces were covered in gold and ivory. He even had exotic animals, like apes and peacocks.
Apes and peacocks. I guess when you're that rich, you can get, whatever pets you want.
And don't forget the horses.
Oh, yeah.
40,000 horse stalls, 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horsemen.
That's a lot of horses.
Yeah.
Where was he getting all this wealth from? I mean, was ancient Israel sitting on a gold mine?
His wealth came from a lot of different places. Strong trade with other nations, taxes from the Israelites, and gifts, lavish gifts, from other rulers who wanted to be on his good side. He even had this fleet of ships, and they sailed all the way to Africa, and they would bring back, all sorts of exotic things.
So it sounds like everybody wanted to be connected to Solomon's success. They wanted to be associated with his wisdom, his prosperity.
Right. And his reputation, it drew people from all over the world, including the Queen of Sheba.
Yeah, the Queen of Sheba. That's a great story. I mean, what was it about Solomon that made her want to travel, all that way to his court?
Well, she had heard the stories about his wisdom and his wealth, but she was a queen in her own right,
Yeah.
She was looking for knowledge, for insight. She came to Solomon with riddles, with questions, testing his intellect, challenging him with these deep questions about life.
So it wasn't just about the gold or the peacocks.
Yeah.
She wanted something deeper.
Yeah, she was looking for a connection with someone who could match her intelligence, her curiosity.
And did she find it?
She did. She left totally impressed, saying that Solomon was even greater than she had expected. She went back to her own land, just filled with admiration for him.
It's amazing how powerful a reputation can be, you know? People are still fascinated by wisdom. And this is thousands of years ago.
And it shows us something really important about Solomon, that he was a man of many talents.
Yeah. He wasn't just a judge or an administrator.
Right. He was like a Renaissance man before the Renaissance.
Okay. So what else could he do?
Besides his skills in law and administration and architecture, he was also an expert in the natural sciences.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, he knew about trees, animals, birds, fish, everything.
Wow. He was building cities too, right?
He was. And not just for storage or the military. He built cities for leisure, too.
Like ancient resorts?
Yeah.
Was there an ancient TripAdvisor so he could see what people thought?
Probably not. But he understood the importance of leisure.
Yeah.
And he also established a shipyard in Ezion-Geber, which, expanded his trade even more.
It seems like he was always building, always expanding. Was there anything this guy couldn't do?
Well, he was a writer and an artist, too. He wrote over 1,000 songs, 3,000 proverbs. And the Song of Solomon, which is a beautiful piece of poetry and drama, he was exploring love and desire. He even got into philosophy. In Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, he's asking these big questions about life.
I mean, it's just incredible how much he accomplished.
It is. It's like he was a polymath, centuries ahead of his time.
Yeah.
It shows you what the human mind can do when it's guided by wisdom and driven by ambition.
But even with all that, even with all of God's blessings, his story takes a turn, right?
It does.
It's where we start to see, the flaws, the
Yeah.
cracks.
Even with all his wisdom, Solomon wasn't immune to temptation.
Yeah.
The power, the pleasure, it got to him.
It's almost like, a classic tragedy.
Yeah.
You have
Yeah.
this wise king who builds this incredible temple, who's beloved by God, and then he falls. It's because he strayed from the path. I think it's a story that people, relate to. Even today, it's like a warning,
It is.
It's hard to believe we're talking about the same Solomon, right? I mean, he starts off with his divine wisdom, and then it all falls apart because he just couldn't resist, the temptations, the excess.
It really is a classic kind of tragedy. But it gets even more interesting when you consider how his legacy continues, even with all the bad choices.
Yeah, it's like even after all that, Solomon's story keeps coming up. The Liberty Study even mentions how he's all over the Bible centuries later, like he just can't be ignored.
Right. And think about Josiah. He's this king really focused on religious reform. And even he mentions Solomon during the Passover celebration, no less.
So even a righteous king like Josiah saw something in Solomon's story. After all the mess-ups, that's kind of wild.
It is. It makes you think maybe Solomon's wisdom, his early achievements, maybe they weren't totally wiped out by his mistakes. Maybe there's still something valuable there.
That's a good point. And there's Nehemiah, right? He used Solomon's story as a warning about the dangers of marrying outside the faith. He pointed to Solomon's wives as the reason he strayed from God.
It's like Solomon's life became this parable,
Yeah.
a story with a moral.
Yeah, it can be applied to all these different situations, all these different times.
Exactly.
Like his name became like a shortcut
Mm,
for both the good of wisdom and the bad of, losing your way.
right.
And it's not just the Old Testament either. Jesus even references him.
Right. It's like you can't tell the story of Israel without talking about Solomon.
Exactly. But Jesus uses those references in some really interesting ways. Like when he's talking about the lilies of the field, he says, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these.
That's a pretty powerful image, comparing all that worldly splendor to the beauty of just nature.
It really is.
It's like this reminder, that the best kind of wealth, the best kind of beauty, it comes from God's creation, not from, fancy clothes or jewels.
Yeah. And then there's that part where Jesus compares himself to Solomon. He's talking about how the Queen of Sheba traveled all that way to hear Solomon's wisdom. And then he says, well, someone greater than Solomon is here.
Wow. That's a bold statement.
It is. But it also suggests that Solomon, even though he made all those mistakes, he was still pointing to something bigger.
That's right.
Like his wisdom, even with all the flaws, it was still a reflection of, higher wisdom. And that wisdom is ultimately revealed in Jesus.
Exactly. And I think that's a key takeaway here.
Yeah.
Solomon's story, it's not just about one person's rise and fall. It's about how we humans, we're always searching for wisdom. It's about that tension between power and purpose.
Yeah.
And it's about how complex faith and human nature really are.
It's a story that people connect with, even thousands of years later.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Why do we keep coming back to it? Why does it feel so relevant?
I think because Solomon represents so many things that we all struggle with, you know? He wants knowledge, he wants success, he wants power, and he's trying to stay true to his values, but it's hard. We all face that.
It's like he's a mirror, reflecting our best selves and, our worst impulses.
And his story, it has lessons for us, especially in a world that's just as chaotic and tempting as his was.
We're still dealing with distractions, right? Still bombarded with messages telling us we need more stuff, more power.
It's like Solomon's story is a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
It reminds us that even when we're blessed, we can still mess up. We can get blinded by success, you know? We can get caught up in the wrong things and lose sight of what really matters.
It makes you think,
It does.
But it also reminds us that we have a choice.
Right.
We can learn from Solomon's mistakes,
Exactly.
seek a deeper wisdom, and put relationships and values, above things.
And I think that's where Solomon's real legacy is, not just in what he did, but in what we can learn from his wins and losses.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Solomon's life, I keep thinking about this. How do we find that kind of wisdom? The kind that Solomon started off looking for, the kind that leads us to, real meaning, even in this crazy world.
It's a great question.
It is.
And I think it starts with realizing that true wisdom, it's not something you just achieve. It's something you work on. You have to be humble. You have to look for guidance. And you have to be willing to learn from your mistakes.
So it's a journey.
Yes.
Not a destination.
Exactly. A process of growing and looking inward. And maybe that's the biggest lesson we can take from Solomon. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep searching for wisdom.
It's almost like two different people,
It is.
You have this incredibly wise Solomon, this builder, this, guy who's so close to God.
Mm-hmm.
And then it all kind of falls apart. Excess, disobedience, it's just like a classic tragedy.
It is. But I think it gets even more interesting when you look at how his story continues, even with the mistakes.
Well, the Liberty Study talks about how he's all over the Bible centuries after he was king.
Right.
He's like woven into their history.
He is. And think about Josiah. I mean, he's this king known for leading this huge religious reform. And he even brings up Solomon during Passover.
So even a righteous king like Josiah saw something in Solomon's story.
Yeah.
Even with all the bad stuff. What do you think that says?
I think it shows that, even though he had all these failings, Solomon's early wisdom, his achievements, they weren't completely forgotten. There's still something there worth remembering, worth learning from.
And Nehemiah too, right?
Mm.
He actually uses Solomon's story as a warning, talking about the dangers of marrying outside the faith. He points to Solomon's wives as the reason he strayed.
It's like Solomon's life, it's almost like a parable.
Yeah.
A story with a moral.
Right, that you can apply to so many different situations.
Right, throughout history.
Yeah. It's like his name, it became a symbol
Yeah.
for the good of wisdom and the bad of, kind of going down the wrong path.
Right, of losing your way.
But it's not just the Old Testament either. I mean, Jesus even talks about him.
He does.
Yeah.
Like, you can't really tell the story of Israel without mentioning Solomon.
Exactly. But it's really interesting how Jesus uses those references, right?
Sure.
Like, think about that part where he talks about the lilies of the field. And he says, even Solomon in all his glory, he wasn't as beautiful as one of these.
It's such a striking image, all that wealth, all that power,
Yeah.
compared to the beauty of just simple, nature.
It's a good point.
It makes you think about where real beauty comes from.
Right.
God's creation, not material things.
Yeah. And then there's that part where Jesus compares himself to Solomon. He was talking about how the Queen of Sheba came all that way to hear Solomon's wisdom. And then he says, but someone greater than Solomon is here.
That's a bold statement.
It is. But doesn't it also suggest that even though Solomon messed up, he was still, in a way, pointing towards something bigger?
I think so.
Like his wisdom, even though it was imperfect, it was still reflecting a higher wisdom, a divine wisdom. And that's revealed in Jesus.
I think that's a really key point.
Yeah.
Solomon's story, it's not just about his rise and fall. It's about our search for wisdom, as human beings. It's about the struggle between power and purpose. And it shows us just how complex faith can be, how complex, we are.
It's a story that still resonates with people, thousands of years later.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Why do we keep coming back to it? What makes it so relevant even today?
Well, I think it's because Solomon, he embodies so much of what we struggle with as humans.
Yeah.
We want knowledge, we want to succeed, we want power, but we also want to do the right thing. It's a constant battle.
He's almost like this mirror reflecting our best selves and, our not so good sides too.
Exactly. And I think his story, it has lessons for us, especially today, when the world feels so chaotic,
Yeah.
so full of temptation.
We're bombarded with messages,
Yeah.
telling us to get more stuff, to be more powerful. It's easy to get distracted.
It is. And that's where Solomon's story becomes this cautionary tale. It's like it's telling us, look, even when you have everything, you can still make bad choices. You can get blinded by success, and forget what really matters.
It's something to think about, for sure.
It is, but it also reminds us that we have a choice.
Right.
We can choose to learn from Solomon's mistakes.
And find that deeper wisdom.
Exactly, to put our relationships first, to focus on our values, not just on material things.
And maybe that's where Solomon's true legacy is.
I think that.
Not just in his accomplishments, but in the lessons we learn from him, both the good and the bad.
Right.
So as we finish up this deep dive into Solomon's life, I keep coming back to this question. How do we cultivate that wisdom? The wisdom that Solomon was searching for, the kind that leads us to a truly meaningful life, even with all the challenges we face.
It's a great question, and one that's worth, really exploring. I think it starts with humility, with realizing that we don't have all the answers. We need to look for guidance, and we need to be willing to learn from our mistakes, not just our successes.
So it's not about reaching a destination, it's about the journey.
Exactly. It's a process. It's about growing and learning and becoming, a better version of yourself. And honestly, I think that's the biggest lesson we can learn from Solomon's life.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep searching for wisdom in all its forms.